Hey everyone, it is time for another recitation, this time on the Redux Car Sales project. So, here our goal for the day is to create an application that has our Mustang, and we should be able to click on these buttons and add features to it, and that should update the features here, we should be able to remove them, and this should also update the total price. Our application is already scaffolded out for us. If we look inside of source, we see that app.js has stuff in it. It has a state object already, and it has these functions remove feature and buy item already added here, and all these subcomponents that are receiving things via props. And I know some of you have difficulty kind of refactoring old code, and that is true. It is often harder than writing new code entirely on your own. But when you all are hired, you're hired to work on existing code bases, which are potentially tens of thousands of lines of code long. So it's good to get practice refactoring old code. Plus, this gives us a really important lesson because we have to make very few changes to this structure in order to get Redux to work. To hook up Redux, it's a bit of work. But again, I want to focus on the idea that, like useReducer, the Redux library is a state management solution. It doesn't change how we normally work with React. So all of these components that are downwind of app.js, that get everything they need via props, that's how they're always going to be, no matter what state management solution that we choose, whether we're doing useState, whether we're using class-based components, whether we're using useReducer, whether we're using Redux. They still expect props, and they're presentational. They are dumb. They take the props, they display the data, they hook up the functions so that you can click on things. So really what we need to do is we need to reconfigure app. And so we're going to do this by writing our reducer, hooking up Redux to our React application, and then connecting app to Redux. So let's do that. So I'm going to create a new directory and call it reducers. And then in here, I'm going to create a file called index.js. I'm going to steal the state out of app and use that as my default state. Because again, the idea with this existing application is this would probably be, something like use state. And then this would be state and set state. And then we would write, whatever actions we would need to take under remove feature and buy item in order to update our state. And we'd pass those down via props to these. These are going to be complicated functions to write. Because we have this kind of big nested data structure. We could try splitting this up into different, variables for state, but we're going to see as we write this, we're going to need access to a bunch of different parts of that state in order to update disparate things, and it starts to get complicated. So our useReducer is one way of simplifying this so that we have kind of our state bundled up, and we're able to write our dispatch functions, which dispatch to our reducer, which handles it. But in my quest to make things dumb, when we did useReducer the other day, yes, we got to move both our initial state and our reducer out of app.js, but we still had to write those functions that called dispatch. So app.js was still a little bit smart. With Redux, we get to move both the initial state and our reducer and the dispatch functions, our action creators in the Redux world, all out of app.js. So now finally app.js gets to be totally dumb, and that is a huge get. And we'll see that in just a bit. So let's get set up. I'm going to steal this state out of here, and I'm going to place it in my reducers file. I'm going to call this initial state. And then I'm going to define my reducer function, which is going to take in state and action. And then I'm going to set up the default switch. So we switch on action.type, And then inside of the body of the switch, I set up a default case for when nothing matches, we want to return state. This is very important in Redux, and it isn't as important in the use reducer paradigm, because we don't pass the initial state to where we create kind of our Redux store, whereas in use reducer, that was one of the arguments. With Redux, we have to make the initial state be the default argument for state. When the reducer is not given an argument for state, it's going to use our initial state, and Redux is going to run our reducer for the first time in order to get it, in order for it to return state. So if we don't have this return state in this default here, the first time Redux tries to execute our reducer to try to get the initial value for state, it'll receive undefined, and that'll be bad. So here's our basic reducer and our initial state. We now need to hook up our application to this. So I'm going to go into index.js, because what we're about to do is very, very similar to what we did with React Router and context. And it turns out React Router uses context under the hood. We need to provide our Redux store to our entire application. That way, anywhere within our application, we can connect our components up to Redux. So we do a couple steps. I've already installed my dependencies, Node Sass, Redux, and React Redux. So we're going to import create store from the normal Redux library, because Redux isn't necessarily entirely intertwined with React. Then I'm also going to import provider from React Redux, and that is a component that is going to do kind of the contexty thing of sharing our data everywhere. I also need to import my reducer, which I need to export from my reducers file. So import reducer from /reducers. Because it's an index.js, I don't need to specify the remainder of that path. Now I need to create my store. So I'm going to call the create store function that I imported and give it my reducer as an argument. So that has hooked up my reducer in my initial state. Now I need to provide that to my application. And we do that very similar to the way that we would wrap this in a router for React Router. We're going to wrap it in a provider, which looks a lot like the context API. Maybe the guy in the React team who wrote Redux and the context API are the same person. Here's a hint. It was Dan Abramoff. My other dependencies, Node Sass, Redux, and React Redux. Those should all be in the training kit as well. We also need to give an argument to provider. We need to give it the store as a prop in order for it to connect the store that we've made and provide that to our application. Again, looks a lot like context. And a lot of these ideas were used when writing the context API. So now we have our application provided with Redux. If we want to hook our application back up, we need to go into app.js, and we're going to need to do that. Suddenly I start getting these errors when I save this file because state is no longer defined. That's because I removed the state from here. So what we're going to do is we're going to add it back in using Redux. So I'm going to import connect from React Redux. And then what we do is we use a pattern very similar to what we saw with forming, with our higher order component style function things. So we call connect, and it takes two sets of arguments. The second is the component that we want to connect. And then the first is two arguments. This is going to be our map state to props. It's going to be a function that receives the state from Redux and then returns an object. And that object is going to be given to our component as props. The second is an object full of all of the functions that we want to connect to our application. Those will also be passed via props. This is how we do our action creators. We haven't quite gotten there yet, so I'm going to leave it as null. For the first one, I want to write, map state to props. This is going to be a function that takes state, and then it needs to return an object that is used as the props for app. If we want our application to have this state object in it again, well, I can kind of cheat, and this is a pattern that you won't generally see, and I'm going to correct it. But I can just make this object have a key called state and give it the value of state, and then I can reference props.state within my app. And whenever we have a key that is the same name as the variable that is the value for that key, we can just put that directly in there. And now I need to add map state to props as the argument to connect. And my app now needs to take props, because by default our app normally doesn't take props. Because our app creates and houses all the state in it, it never receives any data. Redux succeeds finally in making our entire component tree dumb. Nothing has to contain the logic to manage the shared state of our application, or functions to modify the shared state of our application. Every component that we have gets to be dumb. They take in props, they give us back JSX. That's it. With the exception of internal state like informs and stuff, but I don't want to get too deep into that. The important thing is our whole app gets to be dumb now, and that's good. And we'll see if we console log props, and let me pull up my dev console, which I should pretty much always have open anyway while I'm developing. It's getting mad about state not being defined. I can destructure state from my props, like so. And we see that the object for state does indeed have state in it. We also see this dispatch function, kind of like we would with useReducer. If you do not provide this second argument, your action creators, you will just get a dispatch function. And you can write this very much in the same style you did with useReducer. But that's not generally what we want to do. But yeah, now we have our state hooked back up to our app, and we didn't have to modify any of these components because they're dumb. They just receive their props. They don't care where it's from. They do not care about our state management solutions. So, do we have any questions at this point? I know that's a lot of steps.
Yes, I have one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was under the assumption that like you didn't have to do the connect right there. I thought you had to do it within the header or the add features and all that.
No, you don't have to. You can. Because we've provided our React store everywhere inside of our application, we can at will connect anything we want up to Redux. But this was a lot of work connecting this up to Redux. And so generally you don't do it for every single component. Because again, header added features and stuff, they don't need to be aware of Redux. They just need props. We could give those props with connect, or we could give them right from app. It doesn't matter. More commonly, the pattern that you will see is this application is small. It's a single page. It's overkill to use Redux for this. Where Redux really shines is where our application starts to become very large, like Facebook. Facebook is huge. Managing the shared state of that is going to be a nightmare, especially if it's tightly coupled to all of these components that we probably want to reuse across pages. So Redux there really, really helps out. And the more common pattern you're going to see is similar to the one we saw where we used context, where app.js provides our context, and it also does all of our routing, and then we use the context inside each route. And the pattern you'll see with React is you provide your store to the entire app, app handles your routing, and then you connect each route up to Redux, and then give it only the state that it needs, only the parts of state that it needs, and the action creators that it needs. Here, since we're working in a small application, app is our only page, so it's fine just to connect that up to Redux. We don't have to make it more complicated than we need to. Again, we want to make our components dumb, and it's fine to keep them getting their data from props. They don't care where that data comes from. So if we get it to app by hook or by crook, then we can get it into these components, and they get to be none the wiser. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
So would you, well, like, because you have it there, you wouldn't have to do it like in header or in add features, right?
Yeah, because header and add features expect a prop called car that is going to be equal to the object inside our reducers file. They expect to get this object via props. Do they care where that comes from? No. They can receive it via props when it's rendered, or we can also connect them up to Redux and give it with our map state to props function. It would work fine either way, but if we're already hooking if we're already hooking this upstream component up to Redux, then we don't really have a need to hook up the downstream component to Redux, because we can just give that stuff to app and then give it to whatever component needs things via props. And that's the pattern you'll largely see with Redux, is that you'll connect kind of each route to Redux, and then that will pass props down to everything else. You don't really want to be connecting each individual component to Redux, because that's going to make them less reusable, because now you can only use them inside of a Redux application because they are inherently connected to the Redux store. But if we keep them dumb, if we keep them just expecting it via props, then we can use them whatever. Like here, we didn't have Redux, and these things worked, at least presentationally. Now we have Redux, we've connected it to app, and it works, and we haven't had to change any of these components. And that's a huge benefit, because again, Redux has more benefits when working on a large application. So often, you will start writing an application just using normal state management. If it starts to get a little complicated, maybe you bump up to a use reducer. If it starts to get real complicated, then maybe you bust out Redux. But the idea is that we can swap out our state management solutions, and as long as we've kept all of our components, our presentational components, dumb, then they don't care. And that's one of the really great benefits of the Redux component model, is if we can keep them taking data in via props, however we get that data to them via props doesn't really matter.
All right, thank you.
All right, cool. Do we have...
I also have a question.
Yeah.
Where does state come from when we define map state to props?
Yeah, so it is the argument to this function. So connect is going to take this function behind the scenes and hook it up to our reducer, and whatever the output of our reducer function is, that's going to be the value provided to map state to props, because our reducer produces state.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah, and I do want to fix this. This is not something you would generally do, is pass this as a state key. More often you would see, like in the projects today, we would do car and state.car, because as we would hook up each kind of route to Redux, it wouldn't need every single piece of our state data. Here, since we're hooking up app to it, and we kind of have this monolithic state that we're passing via props, it's fine to give it like this. If you're going to see this pattern, it's usually going to look more like this, where we return the state object directly. And then you'll see when this page refreshes, now we're just getting via props all of the properties in state: additional price, car, store, and that's what you're going to see if you need the entire state. I'm going to leave it as is, because this makes me not have to rewrite, this code accessing these things out of state.
Right, but where we define Okay. Okay, it's just a state is just an argument, so it can be pretty much any name, right?
Yes, I could rename this to banana.
Okay. Got you.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Yep, you're welcome. Yeah, and it will be the value of the state produced by our reducer. Okay. Any other questions?
I just had a quick one
Mhm.
to hold up, but I'm trying to follow along here, and I think it's an import dependency issue, but I'm getting an error, failed to comply or compile, can't resolve HTTP2. Do you know?
Yes, I saw this yesterday. I believe that's an issue with the dependency auto-completion in VS Code. If you try to use connect without importing it, VS Code will very helpfully go, oh, I know where connect is. It's from the HTTP2 library. So if you look up here, you should see a line that says import connect from HTTP2 that you did not write. This was just VS Code helping you out. This needs to be imported from React Redux. So.
Oh, it changed it. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, weird bug. Okay. So we've got everything going here. Yeah, any other questions before we move on?
Okay, so you're not importing the use reducer in the app.js?
No. We import use reducer and the reducer in the initial state when using that use reducer hook. Here, we're using the Redux library, which predates the use reducer hook. The guy who wrote the Redux library, Dan Abramoff, is on the React team and helped bring some of those features natively into React, but Redux is its own separate library, and so it has a slightly different pattern. The way we hook up our reducer that we've written in this file with our initial state, the one main difference is we have to have the initial state be the default argument to state, is we do this inside of our index.js. We import our reducer, we import the create store and provider functions from the two Redux libraries, and then we create the store. This is like our call to use reducer, and we give it our reducer, and then we provide the store to our application, and this is like context.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, any other questions? All right, cool. Well then, now we've basically recovered what use reducer was able to give us, which is that we're able to keep this structure of our state and all of the ways in which we're going to change it outside of our app, which is good because that makes app dumber. But if we were using use reducer, we would have to write our dispatch functions directly in app, and that's going to make app smarter. Instead, when we use Redux, we can write these action creators outside of our application and then use connect to provide them via props. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these from app, and then I am going to create a new directory called actions, and then in here I'm going to make an index.js. I'm going to paste these in. I'm also going to rename these slightly. I don't like how there's some inconsistency between feature and item here. I'm just going to call everything feature. So this is going to be remove feature by feature, and these accept a feature as an object. And what these are going to do is they're going to create our actions, which in React we don't have a dispatch function unless we're using the Redux Thunk middleware. Instead, our action creators return the object that's going to be used as our action. So this is going to return a type of remove feature, and this is going to return a type of by feature. And these also are going to need payloads. I'm going to make the payload on each of them the argument they're given, which for now I'm assuming from the way this is written up is going to be a feature object, which when we look at our initial state inside of our reducer file, it's going to be one of these features. Okay, so Lily just asked a question. I was reading that Redux's reducer is more analogous to a map and not to a reduce method. Would you be able to expand on that? That might have to do with the way that Redux is actually implemented. At least the function signature of this function is still that of a reducer. It takes in an initial argument, which is accumulated between each call. The return value of the function is used as the argument for the state in the next one. That's our accumulator. And then the second argument is each element of the list that we're reducing over, in this case the action. And the list that we're reducing over is this kind of queue of messages where we dispatch these messages, these actions, and then they're handled by the reducer one after another. It may be more analogous to a map in that the intermediary values are important, because we don't just like dispatch all of our actions and then it zips over them and reduces them into a single state. As we dispatch each action, it is going to return that state and we're going to use it, and then it's going to move on to the next. So in that case, it might be more analogous to the map. Other languages like Clojure have a function called reductions, which is much more like what the Redux reducer actually is. Which this is a reducer that returns a list of all of the results of the accumulator along the way, instead of just the final result. So if I had to pick what array method it's most like, it would be a reduction style function, where you do get those intermediary results along the way. Okay. So back to our actions. These action creators return our action objects. They're going to receive as an argument one of these feature objects, and that's what I want my payload to be. So I'm just adding that to my action object in each case. So remove feature and by feature each receive one of these feature objects as an argument, and then they're going to pass that off as their payload. And I'm going to make a quick change inside of my reducer, which is something that probably all of you should be doing as you're developing with Redux, which is to put a console log at the top of your reducer that console logs the action. Because this is going to allow you to see what actions are being dispatched. You can also set up the Redux dev tools, which are incredibly powerful, but I'm going to keep it simple here. I'm just going to console log this action. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hook up my action creators, remove feature and by feature, to app.js. So I'm going to pop into app.js, and I'm going to import both of these right after exporting them. So I'm going to import remove feature and by feature. I heard someone unmute yourself. Was there a question?
Yeah, hey Henry. So this pattern of creating action creators, which are functions that return the actions to dispatch.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we follow this pattern? Why don't we just dispatch the action directly?
Yeah. So part of this has to do with the way that Redux is implemented. But the other big feature is that in order to have access to a dispatch function, it needs to be defined within the scope of these. And that dispatch function is inherently tied to the instance of the Redux store that we're providing. So the only way to get the dispatch function that goes along within this store is to be inside of our component tree. And so we could do that inside of app, because we saw here when we don't provide our action creators as the second argument to connect, we get a dispatch function. And that works just like the useReducer dispatch function. But the problem with that is now we have to make app smarter. We would have to write these functions inside of app, which, again, it makes app smarter, which is bad because then more of our application's business logic is tied up into our components, which should be presentational. It also allows us to test these outside of the context of our app. That's another really cool feature of this, is that it is dead simple to write a test on an action creator. You just have to check and see it's returning the correct object. If this was inside app, we can't test it. And so divorcing the logic from our presentational components is very powerful in terms of architecturing our app in a maintainable, scalable, and testable manner. And I'm going to talk a bit more high level about that in a minute. All right, so I want to finish hooking these up. So I've imported these actions, but I cannot, I spelled this one wrong too, but I cannot just immediately go out and use them because all they do is return an object. That doesn't do anything useful. Like Amir pointed out, those objects need to be dispatched. In order to have access to that dispatch function, we have to be inside of our component. But Redux provides us a way of hooking those up to dispatch for us with this second argument here, which is an object full of all of our action creators. So this is where I'm going to add by feature and remove feature. And we'll now see in the props object for our app, we now have two new props, by feature and remove feature. Right? And we can see the function name that they actually are is bind action creator. That's the function that will take the output of the action creator they rewrote and pass it to dispatch. So that's what's going on here. And now these are props, right? So now app is entirely done. App has literally no logic in it other than rendering other components and passing them props. That's amazing. That is so great. That is so great. Because what we have finally achieved is something that you might have heard within your travels in the tech wilderness, which is this MVC thing. This model view controller structure, which is a way of architecturing applications that the user interacts with that helps separate our logic into different places. So React by default is not an MVC framework. An MVC framework has three parts: a model, a view, and a controller. The model is like our initial state. It is literally the model of all of the data in our application. In a default React app, your model is intertwined with your components. It's state inside of those. In the MVC paradigm, our components are called views. Views are the portion of the application that display data and receive user input. Nothing more, nothing less. They're entirely presentational. They're entirely dumb. All of the logic that goes into updating the model lives inside of the controller, which the model dispatches actions to that the controller handles. The controller is our reducer. So this Redux pattern has existed long before React. The idea is we have these three separate parts: our state, our views, and then the logic to handle updating the state and interacting with the view. And separating all of these three things can help our applications grow in a much more reliable and extensible manner. On a small application, being able to do everything inside of the view, it's really efficient. It's really great to just hit the ground running, call use state, get things going, and that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's one of the things that makes React great, is that you can, produce results with it really fast. But in these large-scale applications, having these things separated out makes it kind of much easier to really handle them at the scale of something like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, where there's lots of stuff going on. So that's the big gain that we get out of making all of our components dumb. All of them purely presentational. They get stuff in via props. They ship stuff out via JSX. They're allowed to have internal state, like with our forms, but in terms of the shared state of the application, they are dumb. Okay. So now app has these functions in them, buy feature and remove feature. Yes, my map state to props returns an object that contains a key of state and the value of state. We usually do something like car is state.car and things like this for each value that we need out of state. But doing it this way allows me to not rewrite any of the existing code. Because usually we only want to provide the pieces of state as props that our component is going to need, but app needs all of them. So might as well give it that whole state object. Okay. So now let's get these functions working. They don't really do anything yet, and that's fine. Because inside of our dumb components, we don't really care about how they work. We just need to trigger them in the appropriate places and give them the correct arguments. So if I want to buy a feature, that should happen when I click on one of these buttons, right? So that's inside of additional features. So let's go take a look at that. So our additional features component takes in some props, and then it maps over props.store, and it produces an additional feature component for each one of them. This is great, a very dumb component, a presentational component. And then inside of the additional feature, this is where that button lives. And this is what we want to add the onClick to fire by feature. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to keep all of these subcomponents dumb. They don't need to be connected to Redux. I can just give additional features, the by feature function, as a prop. And then additional features is going to give that as a prop to additional feature, singular. So this is going to provide a prop called byFeature, and its value is going to be props.byFeature, which is the function that we are getting from app.js. And then now, inside of additional feature, we are going to be getting that function via props, and I want to fire it whenever we click on this button. And when we click on this button, I want to call props.byFeature, and I want to give it as an argument the feature object. And we'll figure out what to do with that in just a minute. So this gets props.feature, and let me clean this up a little bit. There we go. So now our dumb components have stayed dumb. They get all their stuff via props. They are unaware of Redux. They do not care how byFeature is implemented. This component just fires it when we click on this button. And we'll see when we click on this button, it does indeed, thanks to that console log in our reducer, dispatch an action where our object has a type byFeature and its payload is the feature that we want to buy. So, any questions here?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm a little confused. Like in the to-do list, for example, when we were adding, or like, I don't know, if we wanted to target the to-do to like delete, we would have to do like a filter on the ID.
Yes.
So I'm wondering why here, what's the different
I'm going to show you in a minute when I implement this why it's easier to just give this entire object rather than its ID. But we can absolutely do that. So the reason we're giving this whole object as a sneak peek is because in order to handle the by feature functionality, it's that we want to put one of these objects inside of this features array for the car. And if I wanted to, I could give this the ID value as a payload, and then I could go and find it out of the store, and then I can add it to the features array. But that's an extra step I don't need to take since I already have access to this entire object, so I might as well just give it along with my payload. But the correct another correct solution would be to do that ID. And I can show what that would look like as well. But here we're just going to do that whole object. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, yeah. So now let's handle this action. So I want to add a case in here. And this is going to be for by feature. We're going to spell it right. And what we want to do is return a modified version of our state object. So we spread state into here. Now, if we look at our initial state, and I'm just going to full screen this so we can see the whole thing. If we look at our initial state, what do we want to modify when we buy a feature? We want to take one of the objects from here, and we want to put it inside of this feature array. And what I saw a lot of people do is this. Features. Right? We want to modify the features key. But this isn't going to work because this features key is not inside of the state object directly. It's not inside this object. It's inside of car. So the key we actually want to modify within state is car. But here's the issue. Car is an object, and we only want to modify one key out of it. So how do we do that? Well, it's literally what we just did with state. State is an object that we want to modify one key out of. So we return a new object. We spread the existing object in here. This time it's state.car. And then the key I want to modify is features. And what I want to do is I want to append an item to the features array, which I would get with state.car.features. And the item that I want to add is my action.payload. That's why I decided to give this entire object as the payload instead of just the ID, because it already has everything I need. So now we'll see when we dispatch this event, we are appending the feature object to this features array, and then our application has already been set up to render that over here as an added feature. I can do this, and we can add them. We can add features more than once, and we start getting warnings about keys. We can fix that behavior in a minute. So if I had just given the ID, which I can simulate, because action.payload.id will be the ID of that feature object. If I wanted to get it using the ID, then I could do const feature is going to equal, I'm going to call this feature object to be a bit more clear. We can do state.store.find, and we want to find the feature where the feature.id is equal to the action.payload.id. And then we would append that to this array. That's just a little bit of extra work, and I already have the object that I want to append to this array, so I'm just going to do that instead. Alright, and if I want to make sure I don't add these things twice, I can use my find function again. So if state.car.features contains an item with that ID, if this feature's ID is equal to my action.payload.id, then I don't want to do anything. I'm just going to return normal state. Right, because that means the object that I'm trying to add is already inside of the features this car contains. But if it's not in there, if we did not find it, then I want to do the thing where I append it to the array. So now, when I click on this, I can add it once, and clicking on it again will dispatch more actions, but they don't end up actually modifying our state. So, questions here?
I'm not sure where I followed you along wrong, but in my additional features, it's saying by feature is not defined. Would you be able to pull that up?
Yeah, so
because I thought you just put it in there.
So you're getting it via props inside of additional features, right? Because in app.js, let me go there first. We're giving by feature as a prop to additional features, and so then inside of additional features, we are using props.by feature that we're passing down.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay.
If we wanted to, we could destructure this from props. So we can use that variable directly, but I haven't done that. So we're just doing props.by feature.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. I don't know where that went off to. Okay. So now we've handled adding these things, and we can't add them twice due to our very nice find array method. Do we have any questions with this?
Not a question, but can you just not move on yet? I'm trying to write things down.
Okay. I do feel this kind of pressure on both ends of I want to go more slowly so that you have more time to follow along and take notes, but we've also already spilled into your project time for the afternoon. You know, these are recorded, so you can always go back and watch, but rewatching an hour plus long video is not always as efficient of taking notes for the first time. So if you could all, you know, just message me if you have time and give me a little bit of feedback of, you know, should I be going slower, going faster? Do you prefer if I spend more time talking about the high-level concepts, talking about solving this problem? Any feedback that you have would be really greatly appreciated here. Okay. So, are you good?
Do we send it to you or like through the Slack channel?
Just direct message me. If you want, you can put it in the after party channel, but you can always just message me directly on Slack. Okay. So, I want to now do our remove feature, which is going to be very similar to our add feature. So, I will keep this open here with our reducer open, and then I'll pop into my app.js because the added features that we're displaying show up in this added features component. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So I'm going to go into components, go into added features. This is receiving props.car.features, excuse me, as a prop. And it's mapping over that and then creating an added feature for each one. And if we look inside of added feature, this contains that X button that we want to put that event listener on. So we slide back up our tree. I'm going to pass the remove feature function as a prop to added features. Then I'm going to jump into added features. I'm going to pass that as a prop down to added feature. So remove item is going to be equal to props.remove item. And I will clean this up just a little bit. So now added feature has access to that function, again via props. We could connect added features to Redux if we wanted to, but app already is, and so there's no need. We can just use our props. So then now I go into added feature, and here we can add our onClick to our button, and this is going to run props.remove feature, and this is going to give this entire feature object again. And there's another hidden reason why I want this whole object that we'll see in just a second. So now when I click on this button, this X, we see we're now, I spelled something wrong. Props.remove feature is not a function. Let's check here. I called this remove item. This should be remove feature, and this should be remove feature. A classic blunder. Okay. So now I add them, and when I click on this X, we are indeed seeing our remove feature action being dispatched. Right now it's not doing anything because we haven't done anything with it in our reducer. So I'm going to return to my reducer, and I'm going to add another case. And this case is for remove feature. And what we're going to do here is we're going to return a modified version of state, state. And what we want to change is the car object. So I'm going to return a modified version of the car object. And the key I want to change is features. Now this is an array that I want to remove any items that are the feature that I received in my action.payload. The easiest way to do this is with filter. So I can do state.car.features.filter, and I can get in a feature, and I can check if this feature.id is not equal to my action.payload.id. And let me again clean this up a little bit. Why didn't that do what I wanted to? And I'm checking not equals because the callback function to filter, if it returns true, then that item is kept. If it returns false, the item is discarded. So we want to keep all the items that are not equal to the ID that we're getting in our payload. Now you might be thinking, well, I don't need the whole object here. I only needed the ID, so we could have passed that as our payload. And you're right, we could have. But first, let's check and see if this works. And then let's check and see if we've forgotten anything. So I click add, and I click remove, and did I spell something wrong? I did. This is why we do like Dustin did in lecture today, and we use variables to contain our action types. I believe we didn't show you that the first couple days because that's an extra step, and you don't really need extra steps when you're trying to learn how to get Redux to work. So we've added these features, and then when I click on this X, we have removed these features. So there we go. Do we have any questions here?
Can you pull up the app.js for a sec and scroll to the bottom? I gotta.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So we're providing our map state to props function. I've decided to return an object that contains the key state. You generally wouldn't do that. You would return the keys out of state that you needed, but since our whole app needs this whole thing, we can.
What do you mean return it out of state if needed?
So
how'd you do?
I just returned this whole thing. Normally what we would do, again, is the pattern we'd see with Redux, is our app would render our routes. We would not hook app up to Redux. We would hook each individual route up to Redux.
That's
and then if
that's
the
where
route,
I got screwed up yesterday with it. I didn't know where, to connect things.
Yeah, and so then if this component needed car, then we'd give it a prop called car, and its value would be state.car. And that's how we would split it up. But here, we're connecting app.js. It needs the whole state object. We can give it the whole state object. But generally, again, we'd be using Redux on larger applications, and the components we would be hooking up would not be our monolithic app. It would be each route, which is going to need different data as props, so we'll give it the specific data that it needs. In the same way that if we had hooked up like additional feature in a header and added features as up to Redux, we would just give them car as a prop and remove feature to the ones that needed it, and so on and so forth. But again, here we can avoid rewriting any of these components by keeping them dumb, keeping it coming from app. Okay. So we've forgotten something, which is that when we add these things, our total doesn't change. And when we remove them, the total also doesn't change. So this might be an issue if we had tightly coupled our components to the state, if we had coupled our model to our view. Because, like, where would the total live? I know we've all run into situations where we're like, ooh, this state is in this component down here, and I need to get it to a component over here. So now I have to kind of rip everything out, put it in, you know, app.js or some higher level component, and then pass it down as props to both. With Redux, all of our state lives together, and all of our actions on that state lives together too. So the total price, if we look at our initial state, it's right in this car object. And both buy feature and remove feature are already modifying this car object, and so we can just add this to our cases and our reducer. We don't have to change anything about the presentational aspects of our component. Our components are doing everything they need to, which is displaying the data that we gave to them, right? That's what a good DOM component does. This reducer handles changing the total price. So when we are buying a feature, I want to modify price, and I'm just going to add to state.car.price the value of the feature that I'm adding, which, since I passed in this whole object, I can just get right out of here. Action.payload.price. Because if we see inside of this console log, which is something you should all be doing, this has a price right in there. So I can do the same thing on remove feature, where previously we had thought, oh, we might just need the ID. Well, now we also need the price, and we can now subtract it from the price of our car. And if we had just gotten the ID, we could have done the whole find thing to get the object, and that's fine. It's just an extra step.
Hey, Henry.
Yes.
If you were to write plus equals there to update the new price, would that be an impure function?
Yes, we wouldn't, if I had done, instead of modifying this object, I had done like state.car.price, like plus equals or minus equals, action.payload.price, this would work. We wouldn't see an error happen because of this, and it would appear to work. The problem is that we're mutating our object directly, and that can have unintended consequences. Because again, we don't really know the order that the reducer is executing all of these. If we have asynchronous reducers, like things might be kind of executing out of order, and we want to avoid mutation, because mutation is efficient and good, and it's easy. This is a lot easier than this here, but this here is much more consistent with how it works, and it makes it a lot easier to reason about when we have things happening in different orders. So we always want to avoid mutating our store directly. Instead, we should be returning the updated store. If we wanted to, we could, since numbers are primitives, I could do const price is equal to state.car.price, and then I could do price minus equals this, and then I could put this right here, but that's just kind of more work. So we're just going to stick to returning an updated object here. And now we can test, and we see that this total amount does go up as we add these, and it goes down as we remove them. So again, one of the advantages of React, we have our whole state within our reducer. It's very easy for what the user feels like a single action, but for that action to actually need to update multiple parts of state, for it to have access to those multiple pieces of state, and to just take care of it all at once. So Yay, Redux. There's a reason we go through all this stuff. So, do we have any questions here?
Can I take a look at your on-click? Because something's going on with my on-clicks not registering.
Sure.
And
so let's look at additional feature. So when we click, we're calling the function that we passed in via props, and we are giving it the whole feature object as an argument. Now, we have to make sure that in app.js, that what we are giving as a prop to this is the value we're getting out of props. The problem is, watch as I remove these from my destructuring of props. I get no errors. And when I click here, I get no errors, but I'm not dispatching any actions. And this is the classical Redux blender. And that is because remove feature and buy feature have both been defined when we import them here. The problem is all this function does is return an object, which is nothing. Doesn't do anything helpful. So it is a function, it is defined, React isn't going to complain to us, but it's never dispatching an action that gets handled by our reducer. That's why we have to add these as this second argument to connect, so that our functions do get hooked up to dispatch, and then we have to use the functions out of props. To be extra safe, you cannot destructure, and you can do props.remove feature and props.buy feature, because those are the versions that we need to use. Those are the ones we're getting from props, not the ones that we are importing.
okay, so it's all right. We do props.remove feature in there,
Yeah.
just for like my sake.
Yes, doing destructuring is largely a stylistic choice. There are some slight technical differences having to do with like refs and shallow copies and the stuff we talked about the other day. I personally prefer destructuring because it allows me to see right at the top of app all of the props it expects to get. I don't have to go hunting, looking for props.whatever. Like if I were to flip over to additional features and be like, quick, what props does this expect? You can't tell immediately. But if I destructured props and got car and remove feature from it, now you know exactly what props this takes.
That makes more sense with the destructuring.
Yeah. And that's why we largely like to do that. But there is no reason you would need to. All right, cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
So it's only with a Redux library we can achieve MVC pattern, right? We can't fully achieve that with use reducer hook. Is that correct?
We can get really close. A common pattern you'll see with use reducer is that you won't actually call that directly in app.js. You'll write a component that looks a lot like provider. And what this does is this calls use reducer. It hooks up the reducer, and then you write all your dispatch functions in there, and then inside of this component you do a context.provider, and that will provide your state and all your dispatch functions everywhere in your application. And then inside of your applications you would use context in order to get those things out of context. And you could do that in one place, like we're doing in app, and with our connect, you can do it in multiple places, like the pattern we saw when we used use context, where we do it in each route to avoid having to pass props in app, which again is the more common pattern. And that gives you most of the functionality of the Redux API. Yes, then you do have to define all of your action creators inside of this fake provider component, and it is a component, but it's an entirely not presentational component. It's a component out of the reality of using hooks. So we're not really violating MVC there. We're just working within the React ecosystem. And there is also a library called React Conflux, which our own Dustin Myers has authored, that uses a context and use reducer to implement a library that works very, very, very closely to the pattern that Redux has. So, yay, thank you, Dustin, for bringing this to the world.
Yeah, so regarding complex, I mean, Dustin hasn't talked through it yet, but have you looked at how it differs from Redux?
Yeah, so I mean, again, it works very similarly to Redux. Like, there is this provider thing, like there is this provider thing, and instead of giving it a store, we give it our reducer, and we give it a context, and then it provides that context to all the child components, and it will contain all of our action creators and our state, and then we write our reducer, we write our initial state, we write our actions, and then there are some tricks here in order to get the whole dispatch thing working, but very, very similar to Redux. Redux is a pattern, you know, this MVC pattern that has existed long before and will continue to exist long after React has gone. And as you journey through different front-end frameworks, both on the web and on desktop and other platforms, you will see aspects of this style show up again and again and again, where you separate your model, your presentational views, and your logic-based controllers. So, yeah, Conflux is just another iteration of this type of design. All right, and I saw Greg asked this question a while ago. I'm sorry, I forgot to answer it. This destructuring just allows you to call the props individually instead of props.whatever, correct? Yes. Yep, that is how destructuring works. Okay, do we have any final questions?
Can you show me how you imported the actions? Because I've seen it done in a couple different ways, and
yep,
I'd like your input on it.
Yep, so I imported my actions via these named imports in my app.js, and then down at the bottom, I connected them to my
So you
app.
don't have to import it. What do you do in the reducer, though?
So I didn't use action type files here for the sake of simplicity, but the correct pattern that I should follow, because it saves mistakes and it also saves typing, is to, inside of my actions files, do export const remove feature is equal to remove feature.
Okay.
And the same thing for, let's change remove to by. And the same thing for by feature. And then inside of my reducer file, I should import remove feature and by feature from // actions, and then use these instead of these actual strings.
Okay.
Yeah, that is the correct and the most common pattern, because you get to use autocomplete, whereas with just strings you will make typos, because these action types get really long, as we started seeing today. Like fetch webcam data, success, failure, something wrong happened right in the middle of it. Like these types get long. You want autocomplete.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Anything else? Okay. Well, I'm going to stop my recording.